Ladies and gentlemen, I call this hearing of the Emerging Threats and Capabilities Subcommittee of the House Armed Services Committee to order. I am pleased to welcome everyone here today for the hearing on the fiscal year 2017 budget request of the United States Cyber Command. Since we last met to talk about the work of U.S. Cybercom, the news has been filled with stories that remind us of the critical job facing the Department of Defense, from the intrusion on the joint staff networks to the compromise of personal information of millions of government personnel and their families. Cyber is proving to be both a domain of warfare on its own as well as a key enabler for all other domains of war. In looking through this most recent budget request, we should be asking ourselves some important questions. Do we have the resources, people, cyber tools, and training needed to be effective? Do we have the necessary policies and authorities to conduct cyber operations? What areas require additional refinement? Are we deterring potential adversaries and contributing to our overall national security? As we tackle these tough questions, I would like to take the opportunity to welcome back as our witness today, Admiral Michael Rogers, Commander of U.S. Cyber Command. One of the major tasks that Admiral Rogers has to contend with is how to operate an environment in our interagency, international, and industry partners. I am pleased to hear that in major upcoming exercise entitled Cyber Guard 16, personnel from the House Administration staff will be participating. I am especially looking forward to hearing the plans for that exercise and how we might also apply its lessons in defending the House of Representatives networks. I would like now to turn to my friend and ranking member, Congressman Jim Langevin from Rhode Island, for any comments he'd like to make.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to welcome Admiral Rogers back before the subcommittee today. It's an honor to have you here, Admiral, and appreciate all you're doing to protect our nation in cyberspace, and certainly look forward to discussing cybersecurity and operational fiscal year 2017 budget requests for U.S. Cyber Command across the department. I've been one of the biggest proponents of cybersecurity as a critical warfighting domain during my time in Congress, so I am pleased to discuss this vital piece of our national security here with you today. As we know, cybersecurity and cyber operations are paramount in today's world. From defending the DoDIN to deterring and defending against adversaries to meeting combatant command needs, cyber is a key component of all strategies across every aspect of national defense and security. As such, the total cybersecurity and cyberspace operations budget for the DoD is $6.8 billion for fiscal year 2017 and ranges from protecting data to operating in the domain. Now, of that investment, approximately $505 million is requested for Cyber Command. Now, the funds requested for the service cyber components to mature the command and increase the capacity of the cyber mission forces make up a substantial portion of that request. Now, while we have made tremendous progress in this area, significant investment over the future years' defense program will still be required. And as the CMF matures, we must work to synchronize investments made by services and other agencies. Now, today, I look forward to receiving an update on the CMF, particularly with regard to the readiness of our service cyber components to meet the initial and fully operational capability goal dates for the teams, as well as the challenges and risks associated with meeting those mandatory deadlines. Now, we must have the right number of teams, we must have the right number of teams, but just as important, we must also have a ready force that is manned, trained, and equipped to meet the mission. Now, I'm particularly pleased that Cyber Command has made progress in measuring readiness. Now, since last year, strides have also been made in establishing a persistent training environment, a necessity for preparedness. Today, I hope to hear more about the steps Cyber Command has taken since last year to promote a joint environment with common standards, such as issuing guiding frameworks for doctrine, organization, training, leadership, education, and policy, as well as whether or not capability baselines for cyber protection teams have been established to ensure interoperability and aligned investments. With respect to the cyber team's missions, There's a whole host of policy questions we must address as we continue to mature our offensive and defensive capabilities and operations. I believe it's imperative that we understand lessons learned from real-world experiences and command and control of the teams and their various roles and missions, capabilities required, authorities used, and new authorities that may be required for more effective operations, as well as internal, external oversight. So finally, Mr. Chairman and Admiral, I look forward to hearing about the status of implementation, acquisition, and personnel management authorities that were granted in the FY16 NDAA. So I know it's a lot to cover. Admiral, you've got a lot on your plate. I appreciate the extraordinary work that you and your team, whether it's at U.S. Cyber Command or at NSA, are doing to protect our country in cyberspace and leveraging all the capabilities for the benefit ultimately of our warfighter and our national defense. So with that, thank you again for testifying here today, Admiral Rogers, and thank you for your service to our nation. And Mr. Chairman, thank you for your attention, your focus, and your support on this issue especially. And I yield back.
Thank you, Congressman Langevin. I'm grateful, Admiral Rogers, that your written statement has been submitted for the record. So we ask that you summarize your comments within the 5-minute rule, which is applicable to all of us and being well maintained by Kevin Gates. Admiral Rogers, you please begin.
Before my clock starts, I'd like to start with, we should be doing this outside, given how beautiful today is. We should be outside. With that, Chairman Wilson, Ranking Member Langevin, distinguished members of the committee, I'm pleased to appear before you today to discuss the opportunities and challenges facing Cyber Command, and I'd like to thank you for convening this forum. It's an honor to represent the individuals of this fine organization, and I'm grateful for and humbled by the opportunity to lead this impressive team. I'm confident you would be extremely proud of the men and women of Cyber Command if you saw their commitment to mission and hard-earned success on a daily basis, as I do. While my written statement goes into greater detail, I'd like to briefly highlight the challenges we face in today's environment and also some of the initiatives the command is pursuing to meet these challenges. Since I testified last year, U.S. Cyber Command has seen an intensification of cyberspace operations by a range of state and non-state actors. We've seen a wide range of malicious cyber activities aimed against both government and private sector targets. At U.S. Cyber Command, we focus on foreign actors that pose a threat to our national interests through cyberspace. At this time, nations still present the greatest or gravest threats to our nation's cybersecurity because they alone can commit the significant resources needed to sustain sophisticated campaigns to penetrate our best guarded networks. But we continue to also look closely for signs of non-state actors making significant improvements in their cyber capabilities. The states we watch most closely remain Russia, China, Iran, and North Korea. The self-proclaimed Islamic State is also a concern, although mainly for their use of cyberspace propaganda and recruiting. In general, these actors conduct a range of cyber activities to support their state's interest. They steal intellectual property, citizens' personal information, and they have intruded into networks ranging from the Joint Staff's unclassified network to networks controlling our nation's critical infrastructure. These threat actors are using cyberspace to shape potential future operations with a view to limiting our options in the event of a crisis. Despite this challenging environment, Cyber Command continues to make progress as its emphasis shifts to operationalizing the command and sustaining its capabilities. Over the past year, we've continued building the capability and capacity of Cyber Command while operating at an ever-increased tempo. We continue to make progress in building the cyber mission force of the 133 teams that will be built and fully operational by 30 September 2018. Today, we have 27 teams that are fully operational and 68 that have attained the initial operating capability landmark. And it's also important to note that even as teams that are not yet fully operational or have even met our initial operational capability, they are contributing to our cyberspace efforts, with nearly 100 teams or elements of those teams conducting cyber operation, to include teams that are supporting Central Command's ongoing efforts to degrade, dismantle, and ultimately defeat ISIL. Last year, I noted we had just established the Joint Force Headquarters DoD Information Networks, or DODIN. Today, I can proudly report that JFHQ DODIN has made great strides towards its goal of leading the day-to-day security and defense of the department's data and networks. Also, as the DoD expands the joint information environment, we will have significantly more confidence in the overall security and resiliency of our systems. Our operations to defend DoD networks and the nation's critical infrastructure proceed in conjunction with a host of federal, industry, and international partners. No single agency or department has the authority, information, or wisdom to accomplish this mission alone, which is why Cyber Command recently updated our understanding with both NSA and the Department of Homeland Security in a cyber action plan to chart our collaboration. Our cyber mission forces to continue to operate safely and in a manner that respects the civil liberties and privacies of American citizens. Additionally, cyber mission teams and joint cyber headquarters are regular participants in the annual exercises of the combatant commands. Cyber Command's own annual exercises, as you've highlighted, Cyber Flag and Cyber Guard, offer unmatched realism as we train with federal, state, industry, and international partners. And while our training is improving, we need a persistent training environment with which the department is continuing to develop to gain necessary operational skills and to sustain readiness across the force. Cyber Command is also actively contributing to the implementation of the new DoD cyber strategy. Senior leaders at the command are leading or serving on teams charged with implementing the strategy's many initiatives, particularly the lines of effort regarding the training and proficiency of the cyber mission force and the broader cyber workforce across the department, as well as the integration of cyber effects in DoD and cross-agency planning efforts. To help with all of this, we needed enhanced acquisition and manpower authorities, and I thank Congress and the President for the authorities granted to Cyber Command in the FY16 National Defense Authorization Act. This represents a significant augmentation of our ability to provide capabilities to our cyber mission teams, as well as our ability to attract and retain a skilled cyber workforce. We are now studying how to best implement the Act's provisions and laying the groundwork needed to put them into effect, while in parallel, evolving a formalized synchronization framework to operationalize and optimize the employment of cyber mission forces. Let me assure the committee that despite the challenging cyber environment we operate in, Cyber Command continues to make significant progress, all while simultaneously conducting cyber operations against determined adversaries. Additionally, the command has a clear path ahead and is actively pursuing new initiatives and authorities to best position the command to address the challenges and opportunities that we will undoubtedly confront. With that, thank you again, Mr. Chairman and members of the committee, for convening this forum and inviting me to speak, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much, and we now will proceed, and Mr. Gates will maintain the 5-minute rule on behalf of all of us as we rotate. And Admiral, I want to thank you again. It is a challenging environment. There are gruesomely capable adversaries, but I just appreciate your service and your colleagues, and however we can back you up. And in regard to that, currently, is the throughput of the training pipeline a limiting factor in our ability to get cyber mission teams up and running? If so, do you have any suggestions on how to improve that situation?
So it's probably the single greatest limiting factor at the moment. It's a little uneven. It impacts more services than others. I would argue at the moment it's probably having more impact on the Air Force probably than any other service. In fact, I just met with all of my service component commanders in February. We reviewed where we are in bringing the mission force online. That review highlighted that to meet initial operational capability for the force, we'll have 91% of that completed on time. That means 9% behind. So I've got between now and the end of the year to figure out what are we going to do to get that 9% back online. I've already seen some improvement just in the 6 weeks, and I, in fact, have highlighted the results of that review with the service chiefs as well as the chairman and the vice chairman, so we're working collectively as a department to move forward. That review also highlighted that when it comes to full operating capability, which is the final milestone, if you will, that's all 133 teams, and at full capability by 30 September of 2018, that right now we assess as of February in the last review, 93% of the force will be delivered on time. We have 7% that we've got to get back online. I've got 2 years to do that. I'm confident that we're going to be able to do it. And as you've said, I'd highlight right now, training throughput, probably the single greatest limiting factor.
And is there anything that we can do to help?
At the moment, I'm still working with the Air Force in particular. I'm not ready to come to you and say I need more external help. I want to make sure we've exhausted everything that we can do internally.
Well, if there's ever been strong bipartisan support,
Yes, sir.
it's people who are here today who want to back you up. Additionally, could you explain the Capabilities Development Group and give us highlights of their work?
So it's a capability that we carved out at Cyber Command, because one of my observations was, and I've said this to the committee before, I believe fiscal year 16 is a tipping point for us as an organization where we will go from a focus on developing capacity to a focus on actually employing the capacity that we've been developing over the last 3 years. You see that reflected in the range of both defensive and offensive real-world operations that we're doing right now. And so part of our capability to do that is generating very specific technical and operational capabilities. And so I thought we needed to carve out a segment of the team that was partnering with the private sector, the rest of DoD, other elements of the government, as well as NSA, about how can we bring together those capacities to generate actual outcomes and capacities and capabilities that we can employ with the force.
Well,
So we've just stood that up.
Well, again, thank you for being innovative. How are you addressing new and emerging cybersecurity challenges not directly related to the network, like vulnerabilities to data links of weapon systems, industrial control systems, or in all capital, the Internet of Things?
Right. So just a few challenges there. That statement.
And I'm glad Congresswoman Stefanik is here because she understood what I asked.
So what I've tried to do is prioritize. I've said industrial control systems and SCADA probably is the next big area for us, because we've got to transition from a focus purely on the network structure. We have to retain that, but we have got to move into other areas. The other areas that really concern me when I look at the problem set are platforms and systems and getting down to individual data concentrations across the department. We've started an effort to look at data concentrations, a focus on industrial control systems and SCADA. I'd highlight in this regard some great work, for example, that the Guard and Reserve are doing. I highlight specifically out in Washington State that the Army National Guard is really doing some interesting work that we're partnering with them on. In fact, the Secretary was just out there to take a look at that about 2 weeks ago. The challenge for now, because I want to set everyone's realistic expectations in a realistic way. I mean, what I've told the leadership of the department is, I acknowledge that this is what we have to do, but we have finite capacity. So it's all about, I have to prioritize. And then we've got to figure out who are the other partners that we have who could bring additional capacity to help us in this fight. And we're in the process of doing that.
And for the benefit of me, can you identify what the Internet of Things means?
So increasingly what you're finding is in the production of almost increasingly everything refrigerators, automobiles, your iron. I was looking at an internet-connected iron, for example, just a little while ago. Increasingly, those everyday devices that we take for granted in the lives we lead are being connected with each other, designed to increase their capability. For example, a refrigerator. Would you be interested in a consumer if your refrigerator was able to tell you what your current milk load is in the refrigerator? When are you going to need to buy more? Could it do that automatically? Could you do upgrades, for example, to systems that you're buying now automatically, remotely, so that you don't have to physically take that device into a dealer or the manufacturer? They can do it remotely. So increasingly, you're finding this connectivity proliferating across almost everything that we are building and buying these days.
Well, thank you so much. And we now proceed to Congressman Langevin.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Yes, it is a bold new world out there, Admiral, for sure. It's just scary, challenging, and fascinating all at once. With respect to cyber mission force issues, policy, authority, and doctrine are paramount to effectively employing the cyber mission force. Yet, those key ingredients lag behind our talent pool and tool sets. Now, given the cyber domain is a relatively new operating environment and the strategic implications associated with operating in that environment, I understand why policy, doctrine, and authorities have taken time to develop. Now, that said, state and non-state actors continue to be aggressive in this environment, and we must move forward. So this committee must also understand how they're developing and being formalized so that we can assist where needed and obviously conduct oversight of activities. So my question is, how are real-world events such as the OPM and joint staff incidents and counter ISIL operations, influencing and shaping policy, authorities, and doctrine are required to effectively employ our force.
So if you take a look at Cyber Command's 3 mission sets, is kind of the way I've been this, and I look at what are the acquisitions and the authorities that we require to make sure we're able to execute each of those 3 missions in an effective and efficient manner. So the first mission, defense of the DoD networks. I'm very comfortable that we have all the authorities that we need, that I can do what I need to do in a timely manner within the department to defend our networks. The second mission is about our ability to generate capacity and capability to support the combatant commanders from the defensive to the offensive. That's an area where, quite frankly, we're trying to use our work, which again, I'm not going to discuss in any great detail in an unclassified setting, but we're trying to use some of the real world insights. You highlighted several of them, ISIL, the last major intrusion we dealt with, which is now almost a year ago. We're asking for the authorities we need for that, and I would highlight, we're seeing a massive amount of change within the last 6 months, so I'm very comfortable that we've identified the requirements, we've got endorsement for what we need to do, and in fact, I'm expecting the last couple of changes we asked for will be signed out by the end of the month. The one area that I think is still the greatest, where we still need more collective work, and I need to work on this too, I don't want to make it sound as if I'm trying to put anybody else on report, is how do you apply DoD-generated capacity in the cyber arena outside the government in the private sector? That's probably the area where I would say we still need to do more work. I'll be honest, it hasn't been my highest priority. As I've told you, every time generally we meet, I always remind everybody, look, there's such a disconnect between the requirements of this mission set and where we are in capability. It's all about prioritization and making smart investments. And so I've consciously prioritized along those 3 missions that I just discussed. So it's the next big area that we really have got to get into.
Good. Thank you, Admiral. What does defense support to civilian authorities look like for cyber? And in our current framework, is our current framework applicable to the cyber domain?
So that's a part of our previous discussion about this fact. I think it's the area where we still need the most work. As I know you're aware, we have an existing framework, DSCA, Defense Support to Civil Authorities, that we currently have in place that talks about how the department will employ its capabilities in support of civil authorities. That structure has been used for decades, from tornado and national and hurricane natural disaster response to a host of other capabilities. It does not, as currently written, explicitly address cyber. So it's one of the areas that we are collectively stepping back and asking ourselves, so how does the DISCA construct apply to cyber? And what's the most effective and efficient way to use it? Because my attitude is, and it's not unique to DISCA, let's start where cyber is very similar to the other mechanisms we've already put in place. Don't reinvent the wheel every time just because it's cyber. And so we have a framework right now through DISCA for how the department provides capacity and capability to support external civil authorities. I think it's an area, as again I've said previously, though, we have to dig into a little bit deeper about how are we going to do that in the cyber arena.
Okay. Maybe to further drill down on this, what best practices from capability development to leadership development are you seeing from the services, and what steps are you taking to institutionalize these best practices across the services?
So I'm going to combine that question with a previous where you asked about, for example, what have you learned from previous events like OPM and the Joint Staff Intrusion. One, and I'll just use this as one example, one of our takeaways from our effort on the Joint Staff was we needed to do a better job of formalizing a common set of defensive tool capabilities across all the defensive teams we're creating. And so I went to each of the services and said, so let's talk about what's the best of breed, what's the best of capabilities that we've identified within each service that we could port across the entire enterprise. Let's not spend a lot of time and money with everybody independently trying to develop similar capabilities. So in fact, the Air Force has a tool that we were very impressed with, and I'm currently working with the services to let's adopt this as the standard across the department. We don't need to do 4 different funding streams here. to go after the same problem sets. We do that with respect, we regularly review training standards and training equivalencies, and when Army, for example, has developed some capabilities in terms of the development of training standards where they have come back to us and asked that we adopt this, which we've agreed. I've talked about, hey, let's use this across the entire department. So we try to do it in a very systematic, ongoing way, because I'm a big fan of we've got to be more efficient and we got to be faster. And the best way to do that is to look across an entire enterprise, both within the department as well as what we're trying to do outside the department. I won't get into that right now for this question, but I'm sure you'll ask me about that later, what we're doing outside the department to try to do those same kinds of things.
Very good. Thank you, Admiral. Okay, you're back.
And thank you, Mr. Langevin. We now proceed to Congressman Mo Brooks of Alabama.
Admiral Rogers, how much is the Cyber Command requesting for this year?
Slightly over $500 million.
How much funding did the Cyber Command receive for FY 2016, the current year?
Slightly under $500 million. It was 400, and if my memory is right, 488 million. The 17 budget requests is an approximate 9% increase over our 16 authorization.
What was it in fiscal year 2015?
I apologize, sir. I don't know it off the top of my head.
Do you recall by any chance for fiscal year 2014?
No, I don't. I apologize.
My recollection, the reason I was asking this is try to get better information than just my recollection, is that the Cyber Command has had significant increases over the last 3 or 4 years. Would that be a fair statement to the best as you can recall?
I would phrase it as our funding has increased in a systematic way over the last few years.
The reason I bring this up, and I'm not sure if you're familiar with it, but America's financial condition has taken a fairly stark turn for the worse. Just to iterate some of the numbers, the Congressional Budget Office is warning us that in about 6 years we're going to hit a string of $1 trillion a year deficits until such time as whatever really bad can happen happens. In my judgment, it would be a debilitating insolvency and bankruptcy of our country. This year, the CBO is telling us that our deficit's going to be $105 billion worse than last year at $544 billion. In terms of our budget, we're right now having some pretty intense discussions in Congress about our $1.07 trillion budget. Keep in mind that there's a lot more off-budget entitlement programs, debt service and the not, and whatnot. But if you have $1.07 trillion in budgetary items that you actually have control over and have to vote on each year, that means that right now we're being asked to borrow about half of what we spend, a little bit over 50%. Money we don't have, can't afford to pay back once we borrow it. And all this is coming to a head. What efficiency measures can the Cyber Command implement in order to help the taxpayer get more bang for the buck for the day when we start seeing sizable cuts across the board in defense and every place else, simply because we've run out of money and we've run out of borrowing capacity?
So we've been doing that since the day U.S. Cyber Command was created. It's one of the reasons, for example, why the department decided to align U.S. Cyber Command and NSA very closely. That the idea was don't replicate the billions of dollars of investment that the nation has made in generating cyber expertise, for example, at the National Security Agency, rather than replicate that scale of investment in U.S. Cyber Command. How can you align them so Cyber Command can take advantage of the investments that have already been made? It goes into the way Cyber Command prioritizes. As I constantly tell the team, nobody gets a blank check. Nobody gets a blank check.
If we're improving efficiency, normally that means that you're getting more done for the same or less or fewer dollars. Why then the request for an increase in spending?
Because I would
9%?
argue, sir, look at the world around you.
I understand it's a very dangerous place.
Vote as well.
Okay, let's assume for a moment.
If I could just
go
finish
ahead.
the thought
Go
for a
ahead.
minute, sir. And I please no way mean to be rude.
No, that's
interrupt,
okay.
But just to finish the thought.
I get interrupted all the time, and I apologize for when I interrupt you. Go ahead.
This is not a mission set that we are going to efficiency our way out of. I just don't believe that that's achievable. In no way should you take from that comment. So, Admiral, are you telling me that you don't have a responsibility to citizens of this nation to execute your mission in an efficient and effective way? That's not what I'm saying. But my only point is the investments that we are making in cyber reflect the nature of the world we're dealing with from a threat perspective. Even as we acknowledge that that threat picture is occurring in an environment in which resources are very tight. I'm the first to acknowledge that. So what I try to do as a commander, what I try to do as a citizen is make sure that what Cyber Command is doing is prioritized, realizing we can't do it all. We try to space events out over a reasonable period of time. That's what I try to make sure we do, because I think you raise a very valid concern. I'm the first.
Okay,
to
I get
share
the
that.
argument. We have a growing threat matrix, therefore we need more funding in order to properly defend against that greater threat. Let's assume for the moment that there aren't any efficiencies that you can implement that would allow us to have the kind of security we want at current funding. Where do you suggest the money come from in the defense budget in order to help with the Cyber Command?
Fortunately, sir, that's not the role that I play.
I thought I'd ask anyways, I understand. Thank
And-
you, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
And thank you very much, Congressman Brooks. And we now proceed to Congressman Brad Ashford of Nebraska.
Thank you, Admiral. And
Sir.
since I've been here, it's just amazing how quickly, from when we had these discussions, when I first met you 14 months ago, where we are today is
Right.
beyond remarkable. You have a lot of questions, and I know, just training for the moment. Do you see, you already have these collaborations with academia and others to help train and increase training capabilities. Do you see an enlargement of that utilizing almost a UARC model, for an example? I mean, I know we're a UARC in Nebraska. There's MIT's a UARC. They have all these various. How do you see, if the mission is training more and more cyber people, how is that an avenue to do that, or how do you see that happening?
I think that's clearly a role. One thing I try to remind people when it comes to training, I think one of the important things is we must ensure that the output we generate is standardized across the entire force. Because if we don't do that, I believe we're going to run into challenges when it comes to actually employing that force. So one of the things that I've been very insistent on, even as we partner across the total force in DoD, and we look at broader partnerships outside the DoD for the mission force that we're creating, is that the team standards, the training approaches we take, the certification standards that we put in place, we have got to standardize those. Now, within those standards, what I tell the team is, look, I'm open to what are the options that are out there, and clearly, academia and the private sector are part of that solution set. To date, we've tended to use them more on the capability side development, if you will, than we have on the training side, although we are doing some things on the training side. But to be honest, I would say to date it has been more on the capability side.
What I see in like my area, companies like First Data, Mutual of Omaha, whatever it is, everybody has those kind of corporate presence somewhere in or near their districts. And then we have Stratcom. So what we have, for example, in Omaha area is Stratcom, and numbers of employees at Stratcom that are contractors, were in the military, whatever, with IT backgrounds, going back and forth, either working at Stratcom or at Offutt or coming back into the private sector. And there's just a huge number of these people in varying degrees of capabilities, some younger, some retired. How do you, maybe you've answered this, but how do you organize that? I mean, there's a clear force there and a lot of capability. How do you bring them, exchange them back and forth? How would that?
So in fact, right now, one of the things we've started in the last year, since our last budget testimony, to take the idea that you've articulated, which is how do you harness the capabilities resident in the private sector, particularly those people who either have previous DoD experience and who are now operating in the private sector. So we have created out in Silicon Valley what we call the United States Cyber Command point of partnership or point of presence. We've tied it into the broader DIUX effort, and what we've done is I put one active individual out there, but then we have identified a team of prior military individuals currently working in Silicon Valley in different companies, and we're asking ourselves, can we use this as an incubator for a model that we can employ elsewhere? We've done it in Silicon Valley in the last year. I was just in Boston at the end of last week. We're going to use Boston as our second test case because of the IT capabilities there. And then I'm looking to see, does this scale into others? Omaha, for example, there's about 5 that we've identified that are possibilities for the future.
I mean, I think it's an incredible concept, and it's to me, it's amazing how quickly you've implemented this, because just a year ago when you were talking
Yes,
about
sir.
this idea, and there's just this abundance, and I'll let it go, Mr. Chairman, because I'm being redundant a bit here, but is that it's amazing the appetite that on the private sector that these major companies have to try give us a way to help, and then we've got all this capability, whatever, and then but you do have to have standards,
Right.
obviously, and then on this whole group of retired or military personnel at Stratcom, it's just to harness that, and you're capturing that. It's very exciting, and I appreciate your efforts. And I think the incubator idea is great, center of excellence, whatever you want to call it. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Now, if I could, just one quick comment. I was out in the Valley 2 weeks ago talking to the team. It's one of the most energizing,
Yeah.
watching these men and women talking about how they can take advantage of what they're doing every day with company X, Y, or Z in the Valley, and how they want to harness their knowledge
Yeah.
and their military experience.
And I see that. We meet with these companies all the time, and Omaha, the first question they have is, how can we help
What can I do?
the military Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
And thank you, Congressman Ashford. And it is encouraging to see Secretary Carter and the public-private cooperation. And speaking of good cooperation, Congressman Doug Lambert, all the way from Colorado.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. And you came all the way from South Carolina. Anyway, Admiral, I'm going to build on some questions that have already been begun by my colleague, Representative Ashford. But you talked about, or he was talking about, and you were responding, corporations in the private sector and academia. What are ways of just fostering this private-public partnership? If there's anything more you could add to that. Because I know there are folks in Colorado Springs that are very keen on this as well.
Yes, sir. So a couple of things come to mind. We've created an exercise series. You heard it in my remarks. The chair mentioned it. We call CyberGuard, where once a year we pick a problem set. We come up with an exercise scenario that crosses the nation so we can bring together entities from across the nation. We bring together private companies, state, local, and federal actors, Cyber Command and the Department of Defense, and we look at, as well as commercial infrastructure providers, for example, and we outline a problem set. We actually create a notional network that reflects, if we're modeling, for example, an attack against the power structure, we actually, in partnership with some of the power companies, we develop a network simulation that replicates the network associated with a large utility. We've done this in multiple areas. This exercise scenario occurs every June. We ask private companies, if you want to participate, we would love to have you. We're up to about 100 right now. We just started this in the last 3 years, and I can remember the first one we had about 3. It's getting to the point now where I'm starting to run into a capacity concern where we've got more interest than there's room. In addition, I'm also trying to, and I'm doing this more on the NSA side first, but the other area that I've tried to highlight potentially with the private sector is there a way to take some of our DoD workforce, have it spend some time in the private sector and then come back to us? Mm-hmm. And is there a way also to have the private sector spend some time with us? That hasn't been the traditional DoD model. It certainly hasn't been the traditional intelligence community model in my other job. But my view is that's kind of among the things that we got to do for the future. We got to view this as much more of a broader partnership. One of my takeaways is, this is just the ultimate team activity. I've never done so much private sector and interagency work in 35 years of military service.
Well, and academia as well.
Yes, sir. Which is why I was just up at Harvard on Thursday when I was up there. I've been to Carnegie Mellon, Berkeley, and Stanford in the last 8 weeks, trying to talk to the private sector about, hey, what can we do? I'm actually in Colorado Springs in 30 days. I'm going to spend a day out there working on a couple things.
That's wonderful. And I like that idea of private-public partnership, collaboration, teamwork, and maybe with some of our allies. what are your thoughts on working with allies, you know, Israel or some of the NATO allies?
Right, so I won't get into the particulars, but in fact, today, U.S. Cyber Command is hosting a deterrence workshop with one of our allies that you just mentioned. I'm not gonna say which one. In addition, we're doing partnerships and capabilities development, probably with, you know, 5 or so key nations right now, foreign nations. In addition, we're also doing things in a much broader front, talking about cyber theory, cyber defense across the NATO alliance, and literally with nations around the world. It is one reason why I spend some time on the road, you know, internationally.
Lastly, with the limited time I have, let me shift gears. Everyone knows the Guard and Reserve make a wonderful component of this effort. You can do cyber from anywhere, and we find Guard and Reserve all throughout the country. You can do it any time, and of course their schedules are, you know, 24/7 as well. Given the wealth of knowledge, experience, and certifications in the Guard and Reserve, would it be prudent to consider a streamlined accessions process to get these specialists onto the job quicker?
I don't intellectually disagree. The only comment I would make is, in my discussions with the Guard and the Reserve segment, when I've asked, so do you have issues that I can help with in terms of your ability to assess and bring into the force, into the Reserve and Guard components, you know, the kind of skill sets and the people we need? Is that an issue for you? To date, the answer I've heard is no. Quite frankly, we have more people trying to get in than we really have space for in some ways. I have not heard the leadership come back to me and say, no, this is really something that's a major issue. I'm not trying to pretend it's not. I'm just trying to highlight it hasn't when I've asked, bubble it to my level. Each service has taken a slightly different approach for how it integrates Guard and Reserves into the broader structure. Some services are looking at Guard and Reserve as a cadre to augment the active side. Other services are, if you look at Army, for example, they are doing wholesale investments in building cyber capacity in the Guard and Reserve over and above what the cyber mission force needs. And Air Force is actually using Guard and Reserve as part of their cyber mission force build.
Yeah, that's what General Hyten was telling us, some of us at
Yes,
the
sir.
Space Power Caucus the other morning. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
And thank you very much, Congressman Lambert. We now proceed to Congressman Jim Cooper of Tennessee.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Admiral, when a congressman like Mr. Brooks asks you how we could get savings from the DoD budget, you might want to remind members of the committee that we have banned the Pentagon from even thinking about any possible BRAC savings. It would be illegal, even though the Air Force, I think, has testified that 25% of their capacity is redundant surplus. So that's easy savings that this committee has willfully ignored. I'm a little worried that I think on the Secretary's trip 2 weeks ago to Joint Base McChord, he met some very interesting people there, and I thought the message he received was that it was easier to hire cyber experts before we bureaucratized everything. Now there's a requirement that you take a 6 to 9 month course, and some of these folks we're trying to recruit could actually teach the course. And they're not going to sit through something like that just to get their stripes when they already have the skills that we're seeking. So I hope that as we seek out these folks, we don't discourage them from coming.
Now, can I make a comment on that?
Sure.
We've created a capability in the regular force that we call our equivalency board, because my concern was, look, we don't want to do a cookie cutter approach, one size fits all, in which we have a formalized process that we give equivalent credit to people based on experience, and not just, hey, did you go to military course X, Y, or Z? So far, I think we've approved almost 500 individuals where we've just granted credit for equivalent experience. We're in the beginnings of an initial discussion with the Guard and the Reserve about, couldn't we use the same thought process on the Guard and Reserve side? So we give people equivalent credit, if you will, for real life experience, so we can be faster and more efficient.
I also hope the Guard and Reserve will get up to speed on locational advantages. I was under the impression from a briefing yesterday that one of the top Guard efforts in cyber will be located in Arkansas. And I don't believe you mentioned that on the list of your visits.
I didn't, but I'm aware of it.
And like, I would think, I've got nothing against Arkansas, but it would not be as target-rich environment as some other parts of the country. But we've got to make sure that we're doing the right thing here. Another question is this: if you were in command, and it turned out in retrospect that during the duration of your command, it had been hacked, and yet you were in charge of that throughout your tenure, you're retired now, what consequence should there be?
I don't like speaking in theoretical, sir. What I generally tell people is, look, we all should be held accountable for our actions, and I'm the first to acknowledge as a commander, I have accountability for the mission set. I don't duck that for 1 minute. I'd rather not get into hypotheticals.
Well, unfortunately, it may not be a hypothetical. I'm not speaking of your case, but in the case of other folks.
Well, who knows, sir? It could be at some point in the future. Rogers isn't the job anymore, and I'm the first to acknowledge that.
But this is an increasing challenge because it's hard to know necessarily when you've been hacked or not and what the consequences of
Yes,
that
sir.
are. So it's a very ambiguous area. Is it currently against the Uniform Code of Military Justice to use improper computer hygiene? Like, it's my impression that you can be a commanding officer and lose your command if you commit adultery, but you can pollute the SIPRNet, and it's really not a legal infraction.
I will say we're having an ongoing discussion about, we have a very, as you've highlighted, we got a very formalized and long practice mechanisms of accountability for performance in a lot of other areas. How do we ensure that we do that same approach in cyber? Because one of the concerns that I have, and I've mentioned this to the committee before, is you can have the greatest defensive structure in the world, but the individual actions of every individual user that we have can make our ability to actually take full advantage of those investments and those capabilities very difficult. And you saw that in the Joint Staff Intrusion, for example, where this ultimately, we were able to defeat the attempt in almost 60 other networks simultaneously, except in this one particular network. The final defense is the user. In this case, we had users who clicked on a link that I said, what would lead you to do this? You know, read this. It doesn't make any sense. And as a result of this, we're spending time, we're spending money, we've got mission operational impact here. We can't afford to have this sort of thing. It's one of the reasons why the previous vice chairman in particular was felt very strongly we got to create this culture of accountability. So we've created an initiative, we call it DC3I, and U.S. Cyber Command is the lead for the department, about what are the kinds of steps we have to do to create that culture of accountability.
Thank you. I see my time has expired.
Thank you, Congressman Cook. We now proceed to Congresswoman Elise Stefanik of New York.
Thank you, Chairman Wilson, and thank you, Chairman, for the great question on the Internet of Things, where we are facing unique challenges as mobile devices and household devices become more interconnected. That increases the likelihood of cyber vulnerability. So it was a great question, and I want to continue working with you on that issue. Admiral Rogers, thank you for being here today, and thank you for your service to our country. Through the posture hearings from the past few months, we have heard about the evolving strategic threats in the cyber realm from a resurgent Russia, destabilizing threats from both state and non-state actors in the Middle East, and overt provocative cyber activity coming out of the Pacific region. So today I want to focus my questions on the evolutions of these threats and how we maintain the edge on a 21st century battlefield. How confident are you moving forward that our cyber capabilities are robust enough to face the threats of the future on these multiple fronts? And then can you speak specifically to your concerns about adversarial cyber capabilities and your assessment of our own cyber capabilities moving forward?
So I feel comfortable with our level of capability. I've yet to run into a threat scenario that we didn't have the expertise to deal with. What concerns me is capacity. How much of it do you have? And as the threats proliferate, our ability to deal with high-end, simultaneous, complicated threats, that's probably the biggest limiting factor for right now, which is why generating the mission force is so critical. That gives us that capacity, as well as the tools and the other investments we're asking the committee and the nation to support to get us to that capacity. In terms of evolution of the threat as I look into the future, I'm going to riff off it just a little, and if this doesn't get to your question, ma'am, you please just tell me. As I look at the evolution of the threat, what concerns me is you're seeing in the last 18 months data in massive quantities now in and of itself has a value that previously we would have said to ourselves, look, this data set is so large, nobody can really do anything with it. OPM, Anthem, those are good examples to us of data now is a commodity that has a value for a variety of purposes, whether it be counterintelligence, whether it be social engineering and helping to refine cyber activity. You're watching, you'll see increased attacks against big data concentrations is a trend of the future. You're watching nation states right now create relationships in many cases with a much broader range of actors out there than we traditionally had seen. I think this is in no small part an attempt to obscure what the real originator and director of the activity is. It potentially or theoretically makes it more difficult for us to go to country X and say, hey, we see this activity going on, you are doing it, this is unacceptable to us, and their ability to say, not us, it's criminal group, it's some other actor. You have criminals in the United States, don't you? You don't control all that, we don't control all that. So you're watching nation states create these partnerships, I think, in no small part to try to obscure our ability to highlight their activity. Criminal activity continues to get more sophisticated. You're going to see a lot more ransomware. You watch over the next year, you'll see a whole lot more ransomware activity.
So based on the FY17 requested increase in funding for cyber capabilities, development, and operational support that you noted before, where do you feel the cyber community is assuming risk for readiness?
So we're still taking more risks than I would like. You look at individual platforms and weapon systems, just because of the scale of the investments, because we're trying to, literally, you are trying to overcome decades of investment in which redundancy, reliability, and defensibility against a cyber threat were just not core design characteristics. And just as you highlighted in your comment about the Internet of Things, this increased connectivity and external connections that we developed in our system, not for bad reasons. I'm not trying to criticize that for 1 minute. If you're interested in designing as a naval officer, if you're interested in designing hull forms for future service combatants, you're interested in understanding how hull forms today are responding to different sea states around the world. So you put telemetry and measurement devices, and then now you're measuring it remotely. That also represents a potential threat vector now for someone to gain access. So we are literally trying to overcome decades of investment in a very different threat world. So it's all about prioritization, and it's going to take us some measure of time to overcome or change that investment strategy. So that would probably be the biggest area in some ways where I go, ooh, that we still, you never have all you want. I don't, particularly in this mission. We're only 6 years old. In May, we'll celebrate our 6th birthday. So, we're new to this.
Well, as you need those resources, it's important for you to continue telling us on this committee to make sure that we're able to maintain the capabilities for our cyber capabilities moving forward. So thank you so much for the thoughtful answer.
And thank you, Councilwoman Stefanik. We now proceed to Councilman Joaquin Castro of Texas.
Thank you, Chairman, and thank you, Admiral, for your testimony here today. I represent San Antonio, Texas, of course, a big military town, and my district includes Lackland Air Force Base, very proudly home to the 24th Air Force. And so I want to ask a question about cyber operators. Have you encountered any issues within the security clearance process in recruiting cyber operators?
I won't say there's none. Nothing that has led me to believe we've got a systematic problem that requires fundamental change. We always are looking to see, can we accelerate or make this faster? If you've been doing this long enough, I just had a discussion with a brand new hire about a month ago who expressed frustration to me, and I said, I know we're working our way through it. I would only tell you that it won't make you happy, young man. Boy, compared to where we were 3 years ago, 5 years ago, we're in a much better place. So it's something we continue to look at, but there's no easy answer here because it's all about that balance.
Right.
You're concerned about threat. On the other hand, you realize, look, you can't execute the mission without good people. and you can't get people in to do the work unless you get them through your system.
Sure. And you mentioned, the speed of processing. Do you see a merit in fast tracking for certain critical positions?
There might be, for some, there's a handful of, if you look across the cyber mission force, there's probably, I would argue, a handful of skill sets where it's either very difficult for us to replicate it in a military environment, so we look to the civilian sector, or the level of knowledge and experience really narrows down the population that's qualified to do the job, so to speak. Those might be a couple things worth looking at.
Sure. No, we'd love to hear your suggestions, at the appropriate time if you do come up with them. So,
Sir.
Thank you. I yield back, Chairman.
And if I could, I'm actually going to be in San Antonio with the 24th and the 25th Air Force in about 10 days. So,
Well, welcome.
sir.
And thank you very much, Congressman Castro. And Admiral, thank you for being here today. I appreciate we had a really good turnout from members of the subcommittee, because what you're doing is so important for our country and what your colleagues are doing, and however we can be supportive. And it's obviously, remarkably, incredibly bipartisan.
Sir.
We are now adjourned.
Thank you.